Good morning, everyone. I'm Craig Finisted. I'm the pastor here at the Water's Edge. Thank you so much for worshiping with us this morning. Hey, if you're new to us, if it's your first time, thank you so much for being with us. We'd love to have you come back and worship with us again. We'd love to have you be part of our church family. This is a wonderful church. We love each other here, and we love God, and we do our best, and we'd love to have you be part of what we're doing out here in West Omaha and throughout the world. Thanks to all those of you who are watching online. I see a number of you are watching from Seattle to Wisconsin to Chicago, and just thank you so much for spending part of your Sunday morning with us. Put in the comment section about how God is speaking to you today. It's a great way to connect with each other and with God. Got some flowers up here. We had a funeral here yesterday. Many of you know Mike Jasa. Mike and Carly were two of our founding members, still very active in our mission and outreach. Mike's dad passed away on Monday afternoon, Monday evening. I was able to be with them shortly before the death, and we hosted the funeral here yesterday. Mike and Carly are just so grateful for all of you who helped make the funeral possible. We had to convert this from a VBS place on Thursday to get ready to host a funeral on Saturday and a luncheon as well. Then a bunch of you came in yesterday and served and turned it back into a worship center and a kids area. So it was about 30 of y'all who served, and they are grateful for every single one of you. Thank you for being generous with the Jasa family and making their funeral possible. They want to just pour out some thanks to each of you. Y'all have been really generous in the last couple weeks. Had a food drive yesterday at Baker's on 180th and Center for all of you who served there. Thanks so much. I heard it went great. We collected a lot of food, a lot of personal hygiene items. Over the years, we've collected over 140,000 pounds of food for people here in Omaha. We partner with Together Omaha. Bob Green, thanks, Bob, for leading that up. We appreciate that. The VBS crew, I don't know if Michelle mentioned this or not, I was upstairs for a few moments. The kids and the families gave over $1,600 to the Hope Center. So that was a really cool offering that we're going to be able to send the Hope Center this week. They do such a cool job in North Omaha. We have a young woman that just volunteered with them as well in a mentoring program, and they had called earlier this week to get a reference for her. And I remember when Ty Schenzel, a good friend of ours who often would speak for me when I'm gone, was the founding director of the Hope Center. The vision is still there. We're the church in West Omaha. We're the church in Omaha that's the furthest away from the Hope Center, but we always said we want to be the church in Omaha that's closest to what they're doing, and it's cool to see y'all supporting them in that way. And then last week we took a offering for Morgan Coyle. Morgan was near the end of her fundraising campaign. She had to raise $3,600 to finish that up. She's going to go to Nicaragua for 2 years. And last week you put her all over the top. It wasn't just $3,600 you gave, it was $5,400 you gave. So she was just so excited about that. Yeah. She was, and here's Morgan. She wanted to tell you all thank you.
Thank you, Water's Edge. I'm in awe of your generosity. It is such a reflection of God's love and grace to me, and it is a huge gift to others. I wouldn't be able to be on this journey without you. I think it's really cool that this church uses the word together so much. Because to me, that's just together in Spanish is what shapes the word in the music does. It's what makes it possible. Juntos somos más. Together we are more. So thank you, Water's Edge, for joining my journey and for continuing to be the hands and feet of Jesus to me. I am incredibly grateful, and I'm excited to walk this journey together.
All right, so next week we're starting a new sermon series. It's called My Life Verse. There will be 3 of us over the next 3 weeks that will be sharing our life verse with you. One of the things that we're going to be doing is we're going to be equipping and helping each of you determine your own life verse. Maybe some of you already have one, maybe some of you don't. But what we're going to do is just help you for this season of your life. Pick a Bible verse. You can memorize that verse. You can cling on to this verse. This verse can give you guidance and direction at this season of your life. So that would be the goal, the desired outcome 3 weeks from now, that y'all would have a life verse that you can just cling on to. I am excited about sharing mine next week. So that's next Sunday. I'll get to share mine. This morning we're going to conclude the series, Stories from the Water's Edge, as we continue to look at the parables of Jesus. Jesus told many parables. There was a day that Jesus was at the water's edge, and there were so many people there, he had to get out onto a boat. And the Bible tells us that Jesus began teaching them in parables. Now, the reason that Jesus taught in parables is he could have just laid out the facts and said, this is the way it is, this is the way to do things. But Jesus knew that story often could convey truth better than facts even could, because it draws us in. It helps us to be part of the narrative, and it applies these timeless truths to our today lives. So the story we're going to look at this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 20, verses 1 through 15. And the story goes like this. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like." So he started off many of his parables by saying those words, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And he's saying this is what it's like according to God's economy. It's like a landowner. And this landowner, he owned a vineyard, and he went out and he found some workers to work for him one day. It was harvest season. It was busy time, so they would have started when the sun rose at 6 a.m., and he promised to pay them a fair day's wage. Now, there was too much work to do for just them, so he went to the town, and there was some workers who were standing around, and it's 9 o'clock in the morning. He says, come and work for me. Work until the day is done when the sun goes down, and I'll pay you what's ever fair. So he does the same thing at noon. He does the same thing at 3 o'clock. And then at 5 o'clock, there's only an hour left in the day. Closer to the equator, the days usually start at 6 and they end at 6. So there's only an hour left to work. And he says, why aren't y'all doing anything? And they said, well, no one has asked us to work for them today. He says, well, just come and work for me for the remainder of the day, and I'll pay you what's fair. So they did that. Now, it's 6 o'clock. It gets dark. The work has to stop. He calls the foreman in. Now, this was just a few weeks before they invented automatic payroll. So they actually had to pay him cash there on the spot. So the landowner, the vineyard owner, he has this idea. He says, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pay everybody the same. I'm going to pay them all a fair day's wage. So I want you to go and give this envelope of money to everybody. And what I want you to do, too, is pay those who came last, like the ones that came just an hour ago, pay them first. And then pay the ones at 3 o'clock, and then pay the ones who came at noon, and then the 9 o'clock ones and the 6 o'clock. Pay them in that order. So the 5 o'clock workers, they opened up their envelope, and they had a full day's wage. Now, there was some excitement there. There was some backslapping, some laughter, some joy, a celebration. They just worked for an hour and they got paid for a full day. And now, if you worked at 6 o'clock, you're doing the math in your head, right? You're thinking, okay, if they got all this money for just 1 hour, we're about to become rich. So they opened up the envelopes, and they got the same. They got a fair day's wage. Now, they weren't too keen on this. They had worked pretty hard, and it didn't seem quite fair that they get the same as the ones who were just there for an hour, and they formed a committee. It was that's what they did in the early church. They formed committees, and they said, let's go talk to him about this, because this ain't right. They got the same so they go, and they said, so what's up? We've been out here for 12 hours. It's hot, we're sunburned, we're scratched. This has not been fun. And these people that just came an hour ago and picked a few grapes and helped us clean up, they made as much as we did. So now it's the landowner's turn to talk. Now, remember, Jesus said the kingdom of heaven is like, so the landowner here is God. We're the workers. So the landowner says to those who were there at 6 o'clock, what are you complaining about? I paid you exactly what I told you I'd pay you. You work a fair day, I pay you a fair day's wage. It's my money. I can do whatever I want with my money. Are you envious? Because I'm generous. Why do you begrudge my generosity? So that's the end of the story. Jesus says nothing after that regarding the story. And I remember the first time I read the story. I remember when I read the story this week for the first time on Monday. I remember when I read the story a few hours ago when I woke up today. There's something about this story that's not right. And the reason I say that is because I grew up in the heart of America. I grew up in a town of 1,200 people. I know what it's like to work on a farm. I have actually fed pigs before. I have gathered eggs. I have milked cows. And has anybody in here ever walked beans before? Just a real quick show of hands. You walk beans. Hey, you've walked beans. That means you're older than 45 years old, because people, they started riding beans after that, like with a little buggy and the little spray things. Now the tractors just like spray a bunch of stuff on it, and you don't need to do any of that kind of stuff anymore. But so to walk beans, you would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, right when the sun's rising. You'd take your hoe, you'd walk down like 2 or 3 rows at a time, and you'd just chop all the weeds, right? And you get to the end, and you turn around, and you do it again, and this is tough work. Like, you get sunburned, you sweat, your feet get wet, there's bugs you have to deal with. Physically, it's, challenging work. Now, does anybody want to take a guess how much I made walking beans in 1985, 1984? I made a whopping $3.35 an hour. So we'd work from like 6 to noon before it would get too hot, and we'd quit. And he'd give us $20. And man, I had more money then than I do now. I'm not sure how that works. But we go to Stoner's Cafe, and we get a cheeseburger and french fries and a milkshake for $2.25. And you still had $17.75 for the rest of the day, and there's no way you could spend that much money that quickly in that little town. Amazon.com wasn't invented until later. Fortnite, you couldn't buy those skins back then. You just had to. So I read this story, and it doesn't make sense to me. But then I remember, Jesus is not giving us a lecture in agricultural economics. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like. So it takes us to our first lesson. You just be patient with me on this one. I believe what you're going to see on the screen. Just let me unpack it. God is not fair. That's just the way it is. Now, the world is not fair either. So you guys know the story. It's like this woman, she works for the government, and she goes in early, she stays late, she's the one that doesn't take a lunch break, she's the one that keeps the break room clean, she's the one that makes sure everything gets done on time, she's the one that's willing to help anybody else out during their normal hours, and she'll stay late during the night so she can get her stuff done. And everybody in the office knows that she's pretty much the top performer. It comes time for the performance reviews. The boss calls her in and says, you've just killed it this year. You have done an amazing job. Everybody in this office likes you. They respect you. You make us all better. Thank you for that. Now, my boss's boss was kind of thinking this year, for solidarity, for morale, that we're just all going to get the same raise. I wish I could give you more, but I can't. That conversation's actually happened before. Life is not fair. I was thinking about a guy, brother on the West Coast, a sister on the East Coast, parents who were failing in health. There was a whole decade of his life that he was taking his mom to the pharmacist and the doctor, and he did the bills and cleaned the house and mowed the yard, and he was the one who was doing all the work. Now the siblings, once in a while, when he did hear from them, they would thank him, but he's still the one that did all the work. The parents die, the will is read. Not surprising to any of us. The estate is divided equally in 3 parts because the parents love all the children the same. And that's just something we got to deal with. And life is not fair, but we would think if life is not fair, then God should be. At least there should be one rock that we can turn to. So there's a problem with this morning's parable. Now, the problem with this parable is certainly not the way that Jesus speaks it. The problem with this parable is not the way that Matthew records it. The problem with this parable is the way that we read it. Because I think that, you would read this parable the same way that I would read this parable, and we're not reading this parable correctly. We read this parable like we're the ones who showed up in the vineyard at 6 o'clock. Like we're the ones who sweated under the hot sun for 12 hours. Like we're the ones who never disobeyed the master. Like we're the ones who deserve the fair day's pay. And I'll tell you what, as far as I'm concerned, I was not there at 6 o'clock in the morning. I just wasn't there. And for those, and you weren't there either. For those of you who showed up at 9 o'clock in the morning, you're the saints among us. We look up to you. Your faith, it inspires us. But you're going to be the first ones to admit that you weren't the best of workers either. There's been times you snuck out of the vineyard. There's times you disobeyed the master. There's times you did things your way instead of the vineyard owner's way. You took breaks. You didn't listen. Now, some of us, I probably showed up at noon. Some of you joined me with that. There's some of you that showed up at 3 o'clock. And we weren't the best of workers all the time either. Sometimes, we hit a home run. Sometimes we did great. But the bottom line is we were not there at 6 o'clock in the morning. There's only one person who has any right to complain. There's only one person who showed up at 6 o'clock, and it's not any of us. His name is Jesus. So Jesus is the only one who has the right to complain that things are unfair, and he didn't complain. Instead, what he did is he sweated. He got sunburned. He got blistered. He got beat up. He was put to death on a cross, and he didn't complain. In fact, what he did is he showed us at the end love and grace. It's the same thing that he teaches us in this parable. His very death exemplified the thing that he tried to teach us in his life, and that is this concept of grace. Now, if you want to talk about fairness, here's fairness. Romans chapter 3, verse 23 says that we have all sinned and fall short of God's glorious standard. I have sinned and I have fallen short of God's glorious standard. You have sinned and you fall short of God's glorious standard. There's things that we didn't do that we should have done. There's things that we did that we shouldn't have done. There's words that we wish we could take back. There's actions that we have that we wish we could hit the rewind button and not do that one over again. We've hurt other people. We have hurt ourselves. Now, Paul says later in Romans chapter 6, for the wages of sin is death. Now, fairness, according to the New Testament, is that we are all sinners. And the wages of sin is death, and that's fairness. Now, fairness does not work, and God figured that out. God knew that. So God sent his son, Jesus, to show us lesson number 2, and that is that God is better than fair. So point 1, God is not fair. Point 2, God is better than fair. God is good. God is generous. So let's continue with what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 5. But as people sinned more and more, God's wonderful grace became more abundant. So I remember once, it was on a Monday night, because I remember I was watching a football game. And we had a small group of young adults that met on Monday nights, and they called me up once during their small group meeting, and they were looking at this verse, and they were looking at a different translation. I think that translation probably said something like, our sin increases, God's grace increases even more. So I said, Craig, we got a question for you. So if our sin increases and God's grace increases even more, doesn't that mean we should sin more so we can experience more grace? And I thought about it for a second, and I said, well, I've never been asked this question before. Let me think about it. No. It doesn't mean that, because there's consequences to our sin. Our sin hurts ourselves. Our sin hurts other people. It can be devastating. There's better ways of experiencing grace than sin. So I'm going to read the whole verse, chapter 6, verse 23. I'm going to read the whole verse here. I read the first half just a little bit ago. For the wages of sin is death. Now, Paul did not stop there. I stopped there about 2 or 3 minutes ago. Paul continues, but the free gift of God is eternal life through Christ Jesus our Lord. So, I want to let you know, I believe and I thank God every morning that he's not fair, because God is good and God is generous. And when we begrudge God's generosity, it's only because we are unaware of where we stand in the line. Jesus was there at 6 o'clock. He's the only one who has any right to complain. The rest of us who showed up at 9 o'clock and noon and 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock, and we weren't even perfect workers when we were there, we're getting a whole lot more than we deserve. We no longer live under the justice that is found in the Hebrew Scriptures. We live under the grace that is found in the New Testament and made possible by the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Now, I want to look at one more thing in this parable. This is a parable about grace. But there's one other thing in this parable I want us to look at, and it's the third and final thing I want you to remember this morning, and that is that God's kingdom, the vineyard, is the place to be. So I went to seminary in Atlanta, Georgia. We lived in Buckhead. We drove to Decatur. It's about a 25-minute drive. There was a season that my air conditioner didn't work, and I didn't have any money to fix it. So I used the old school air conditioner. I rolled the window down, and this hot, sticky city, I'd be driving to school, and I'd stop at the stoplights, and the windows were down, and the people were right there, and you would just, every corner in a few of the neighborhoods, you would just see dozens of men, most of them from Central America. They were just standing there, waiting for somebody to come and hire them for the day so they could feed their families that night. Some of them were going to be roofers, some of them were going to be painters, some of them were going to be landscapers. They didn't know what they were going to do, but they were willing to do whatever. Now, a few hours later, I would drive back home after the classes and the chapel was done, and most of them were gone, but some of them would still be standing there, just waiting for a truck to pull up and offer them a job and a fair day's wage. Now, I observe the world, and sometimes it reminds me of those men standing in the corners in Atlanta. Like, they're looking for something to do. They're looking for a greater purpose than what they're currently experiencing. I look at the culture and I see people who are very busy, but they're bored because they're busy doing the wrong things. I observe that we live in an age of distraction. I observe that we live in an age of anxiety, that we're nervous about the future that we don't really control. I observe that we compare ourselves to other people to determine our worth. I observe that if we could have a few things in this world today, in this culture today, that focus and passion would be two of those things. I see that we live in a world where there needs to be less judging and more listening. It breaks my heart to see good people arguing about the news and the events of the day and taking it so personally. I wish we would judge less and understand more. If I sat down with any of you, we're not going to agree on everything. We're just not. We may not agree on taxes. We may not agree on abortion. We may not agree on immigration. But what I would hope at the end of the conversation is that you could look at me and you could say, I like Craig. He's a good man. He's thought this stuff through. I don't agree with him, but I do respect him. And I would hope likewise that I could look at you and I could say, I like Sarah. I like Paul. I don't agree with them on this or that, but I understand where they're coming from. I respect them. Now, we just look at people and, here's the plea. Don't judge somebody's story by the chapter that you walked in on. You just don't do that. That's not what people in the vineyard do. That's not the way that it works in God's kingdom. Now, the kingdom, it's the place to be. I want to talk about this issue for a little bit of the 5 o'clock workers and the 3 o'clock workers getting paid first. So there has been so much grace given to me in my life. I can go back to my birth. I can talk about a grandma that prayed for me since the day I was born. I can talk about the grace of stumbling on a small group in college. Some guys and some adult men who just poured their life into me. I can talk about a church in Kentucky that mentored me and called me to go to seminary. I can talk about the school that I went to that formed my life for 3 consecutive years. I can talk about the churches I've served at, and there's no greater church than the one that we're in right now. Y'all are a church about grace. Now, not everybody has had those same opportunities. I remember shortly after we opened our doors here, there was a woman that wanted to talk to me, and she still comes. I talked to her about this. She wants me to share this with y'all. She said that church for her throughout her adult life has been a great big challenge. And the reason that it's been a challenge is because she was abused by her dad when she was a little girl. And when the pastor or the priest talks about the fatherhood of God, she already has a notion of what she thinks of her father. It was a struggle to think about the Heavenly Father any differently. Now she's there now. It took her a long time to get to that place. She wasn't in the vineyard as early as me. But you know what? I'm thankful for grace. Because grace says that I don't know the beginning part of her story, but she gets paid the same as me. And if she gets paid a little bit before me, I'm totally cool with that because I want her to experience the same thing I've experienced. My 11-year-old son was talking to a group of friends, and they were asking, what the dads did. And, my dad works for OPPD, and my dad's a banker, and my dad's a teacher, and David said my dad's a pastor. And one of the friends asked, what's a pastor? He didn't know. No one ever told him. Just like those workers standing on the corner at noon and 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock, they didn't know. Nobody ever told them. There's a lot of us around here that worked really hard this week, like VBS and funerals and getting ready for worship and all that kind of stuff. And you know what? I am glad. I am so grateful that Jesus is going to give the same grace to that kid that doesn't know what a pastor is than he is to the hardworking people of the vineyard. Grace is saying okay, I'm God. I'm the only one that can sort this out. Don't worry about judging. Don't worry about your place in the line. Let me take care of all that. Just understand and accept that at the end of the day, when the sun sets and the cool breeze stirs in the dusk, that you're going to get a whole lot more than you deserve. I'm not fair. I am better than fair. I'm good. I'm generous. So the vineyard is like this. The kids at the VBS, parents, if you're here at the end of the night, you saw it. John 10, chapter 10, this is the kingdom, this is the vineyard. Jesus says, I have come. You don't deal with justice anymore, you deal with grace. I have come that you may have life, and you may have it in all of its fullness. Here in this world, it's amazing, it's abundant, it's full, it's fruitful, it's great. And the world to come, it's going to last forever.